today the U.S. Supreme Court took a case that involves an appeal of an immigration policy implemented by the Trump administration during the first administration. The policy was put in place in April of 2018, and it was one in which the government implemented a metering system at the United States borders, mostly the border with Mexico, whereby they said they would only accept a certain number of people a day to come through the border to make an appeal for asylum. Now, the way that the law works is that anyone who is either present in the United States, in the soil of the United States, or has arrived at the United States, has a right to make a petition for asylum. And what this policy did at the southern border largely is allowed, kind of rationed, or set a quota every day of how many people they would allow to actually enter the United States. So Border Patrol people would be stationed on the Mexico side of the US border before people could set foot in the United States, and said, you have to wait there, and we will allow only a certain number of people in every day. Now, this policy was repealed in November of 2021. So it's been 4 years that it has not been in effect. But the Supreme Court took the appeal out of the Ninth Circuit, where the people, this group called Al Otro Lado, the other side, that is based in Tijuana, Mexico, challenged the metering system and the US government's refusal to even accept asylum petitions by people coming across our southern border. It went to a district court in California and then the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and Al Otro Lado won in each of those contexts. But again, the policy is not in effect anymore. It hasn't been for 4 years. So what the Supreme Court has agreed to do is basically issue what's called an advisory opinion, that in case this thing ever happens again, or we'll just opine on something that isn't happening anymore, we will issue a ruling on that. And this is something that the Supreme Court over and over and over and over and over again says, we do not issue advisory opinions. We only will decide cases where there's an active controversy, an active legal issue. So what the court is doing is reaching out and grabbing a legal issue that is no longer an alive one, I don't know, so that in case Trump wants to re-implement this down the road, he's already gotten a green light from the Supreme Court, or it's just that this Supreme Court feels like the more we can say the government can do whatever they want, even on an advisory level, we're happy to. So that's what the issue is. But what I want to kind of give some flavor about it for all of you is that I went to the southern border in Tijuana in March of 2019 with a group of Columbia students to work with Al Otro Lado, because we knew that this policy was in place and how it was backing up people in Tijuana and other Mexican cities at the US border and creating enormous risk for those people who had crossed jungles, rivers. You know, some of the people we met from Africa, they'd flown, they'd taken boats, the things they had gone through in order to finally appear in Tijuana, thinking, rightfully, at least legally, that they had a legal right to present themselves and say, I have been persecuted in my home country, I am here to appeal for asylum. But they were then being put into this metering system. So how did it work? I learned so much when I was there. So what the US government did is it set up a system where people would line up every morning early on the Mexico side of the border and wait until this little tent was staffed, and there was a book, a handwritten book, where you would write your name down and your country down, and then you would get a little piece of paper, handwritten piece of paper with a number on it. And who was actually doing this? Who was in the tent, holding the book, writing the number on the piece of paper? Other asylum seekers. So they made the very people who who were seeking asylum administer the metering system. So you might wait all day, you get your name in the book, and then you go away with your number. It could be 2,379, right? And then you waited until your number was called. That could be days, it could be weeks. In the meantime, Tijuana became an extremely dangerous place because people were trapped there, waiting to get across the border. Human trafficking was rampant while we were there. It's even hard to talk about. There was a house down the street from where we were staying, a building where we were told, we didn't go in, where children seeking asylum, they'd been separated, or maybe they were teenagers and they came unaccompanied. They had been kidnapped, trafficked, put in that building to be trafficked for their organs. Not just sex trafficking, but organ trafficking. This is the kind of moral peril that this metering system created. Desperate people all being forced into a place where they could be so easily exploited. So then every morning, the people with the little piece of paper would go check a sign that Al Otro Lado had put up on outside their office saying, today's number begins with X. So those are the numbers that would be called, that would be allowed to those people who held those little pieces of paper with those numbers to get through. So they would line up in the morning with their pieces of paper, again in the same place, waiting for their numbers to get called. Sometimes there would be no one called. Sometimes 5 people would be called. Sometimes 20 people would be called or more. You just never knew how far down the list they were going to get that day. But if you were lucky enough to get called, you'd be put in a little van and taken in this little back way through the border and put into the hilera, which in Spanish means the freezer. And it was this underground bunker where they put people to wait for processing. And the temperature was purposefully set in the 40s, very cold. And people had just come from Tijuana with no clothes, nothing, right? Waiting to be processed and then put in the hilera. People would get sick. Bad things happened in the hilera. But before they would get online and maybe be put into the hilera, remember, there was family separation. And so we would see people standing there with Sharpies. We would actually hand them the Sharpies, writing their cell phone numbers on their children's arms, because they knew they would likely be separated. And here we were participating in this by giving people Sharpies to do this. So that's part of what the metering system created. And then while we were there, also a delegation of Democratic attorneys general showed up. Tish James, Josh Shapiro, Maura Healey. So Healey's now the governor of Massachusetts, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. They came down to see what was going on. And in these pictures, they were standing in the area where people line up on top of the hilera. The hilera was just under them. And I was standing next to Tish James and I said, just so you know, I want to explain what's going on here. You were standing over these bodies that are freezing downstairs. And she looked at me and her face just fell. They had no idea how hard this was. So this is the issue the court has taken up. Even though expired, this deliberately created form of, I say, torture and human suffering in Tijuana that we were part of, and the students I went with were fantastic. There were great students from the University of Chicago there too. But the metering system sounds innocuous when you describe it, but the way it actually worked was horrendous. And we were lucky to work with Al Otro Lado, and if you don't know them, they're an incredibly important group. Make a donation to them. Go volunteer if you speak any Spanish down in Tijuana. The conditions have changed since when we were there in 2019, but they're still very bad. So I just want to give you that backstory of what the case is that's being decided now by the Supreme Court on a policy that doesn't exist anymore, but they're probably going to uphold. And this is the kind of circumstances they're upholding, is this level of human suffering caused intentionally during the first Trump administration.